All right, it is just now 2 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for the 24th Annual Elder Abuse Conference, Evolving Interventions and Resources. This conference is presented by Caring Transitions of Syracuse, and my name is Lauren Ulrich, and I am the Abuse in Later Life Prevention and Outreach Coordinator at Vera House. All webinars offered during this conference are free thanks to the generous support of our sponsors. In addition to our presenting sponsor, this year we are fortunate to have 3 platinum sponsors, and those are Onondaga County Department of Adult and Long-Term Care Services, Loretto, and Syracuse Jewish Family Service. I'd also like to acknowledge our gold sponsor Wegmans and our silver sponsors, At Home Independent Living, Bousquet Holstein PLLC, Christopher Community Incorporated, Community Bank, Countryside Federal Credit Union, Fulton Savings Bank, Geddes Federal Savings and Loan Association, the Marone Law Firm, and Touching Hearts at Home. And just as a reminder, more information about all of our sponsors can be found on the Vera House website at our virtual resource table link, which can be found on the conference registration page. The support of these sponsors not only funds this webinar series, but also extends beyond this conference to continue our elder abuse education, outreach, and prevention work after this event. And just a final announcement before we begin today, the chat feature in this webinar has been disabled, but you're welcome to submit questions via the Q&A feature. We're fortunate to have 3 presenters today, and so we will reserve time at the end of each presenter's portion to address questions that come to them. So when a presenter concludes their portion, they'll be able to address any questions that were directed during their time. So without further ado, we'll begin today's session, Protecting Vulnerable Adults from Financial Exploitation. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to our presenters today. David Godfrey, Senior Attorney to the American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging, Judy Shaw, Securities Administrator at the Office of Securities and Co-Chair of the Maine Council for Elder Abuse Prevention, and Martin Hewitt, Special Counsel at Freed, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, Commissioner of the American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging, and Vera House Foundation Trustee. So with that, Martin, I will be turning it over to you to begin today's session. And Martin, I believe you're muted.
So one thing we all try not to do, and I did it first off, so there you go. So before I start off today, I want to thank my 2 friends, Judy and David, for being here. They have been tireless in putting this program together, and we've worked on projects together over the years, and it's good to be doing this with good friends. So to start out, I just want to give you a selected aging demographics. Of particular interest, I think, are the following: that by the year 2025, there will be 1.2 billion older people worldwide, that we have a net increase of 1 million people 60 years of age worldwide monthly now, that the leading age of 77 million US baby boomers reached age 65 in 2011, and that 10,000 persons qualify for Medicare will be qualifying for Medicare every day for the next 19 years. Regarding the scope of the issue, I think it's important to note the following. 1 in 10 elder adults are abused every year. In 90% of elder abuse cases, a family member is the abuser. Victims of abuse are 3 times more likely to be admitted to the ER. Injuries are estimated to add $5.3 billion to annual health costs. And finally, the survey found that 2015 TrueLink Senior Vulnerability Survey found older adults lose $36.48 billion to financial abuse. That is just staggering. So I'd like to continue on now and turn this over to David. I just want to give you a little more information about David. He is a senior attorney at the ABA Commission on Law and Aging in Washington, D.C. He was responsible for the ABA's role in the Administration on Aging, funded National Center on Law and Elder Rights. Prior to joining the commission, he was responsible for elder law programming at Access to Justice Foundation in Kentucky. Mr. Godfrey earned his BA with honors at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, and his JD cum laude from the University of Louisville, School of Law in Kentucky. He served on the board of the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys and was named a Fellow of the Academy in 2019. So with that, I will now turn this over to David.
Yes. Lauren, can you move forward to slide number 5, the 2019 Adult Protective Services by the numbers slide. So a few years ago, they put the federal government put out a set of standards for voluntary reporting by adult protective services programs based on a set of uniform definitions published by the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, on adult protective services for persons age 60 and older. It was tied to age 60 because that's the eligibility age for Older Americans Act services. And it's called the National Elder Maltreatment Reporting System, or NAMERS. If you do a search in your favorite search engine for elder abuse statistics and numbers, you should be able to find it. In 2019, which is the first year that data was available and the most recent year that data was available, there were about 1,316,000 reports received by APS programs. A little over a third of those didn't meet the eligibility requirement for APS to investigate. They were screened out. I always tell people sooner report and have them determine that they can't help than to fail to report on a case that they might have been able to help. Of the about 62% that they were able to investigate, there's a breakdown there of who they were submitted by. About 64% were submitted by professionals, and people ask why so high? Because professionals in law or professionals in medicine and healthcare and emergency services and social workers in most states are mandatory reporters. If they have a reason to believe that a person is that an adult is experiencing abuse, neglect, or exploitation, they're obligated by law to report. And about 64% of the reports are coming from professionals, about 11% from relatives, about 4% self-reports. As we always encourage people to self-report, and lawyers have an interest, a complicated relationship because of the ethics rules on whether lawyers can report or not report. In most states, a lawyer can't report suspicion of abuse, neglect, or exploitation without their client's permission. So unless the person who's experiencing that is not a client, lawyers are prevented from reporting without their client's permission, but we encourage self-reports and about 21.8% others. The types of allegations, about half of them are self-neglect, about 24% are neglect, about 24% are exploitation, physical abuse, sexual abuse, 1.6%. When I first started working in elder abuse and I saw definitions for sexual abuse and older adults, I was kind of, well, I wonder why sexual abuse is there, but 1.6% of the allegations were sexual abuse. Self-neglect is included, not because it's a crime, but if it's not included in the definitions within a state, then Adult Protective Services struggles with whether they have jurisdiction to try to provide help for a person who's experiencing self-neglect. So it's included in the definition in almost every state. We just concluded an update on definitions of elder abuse, and we found that 2 or 3 states that hadn't included self-neglect previously have added it in the last 18 months. So the about 802,000 reports that they investigated, about 67% of them they were unable to substantiate. That doesn't mean abuse didn't happen. It means that Adult Protective Services was not able to find sufficient credible evidence to sustain a case moving forward. About a third of the cases they were able to do so. And about, say, someplace between 40 and 50% of these persons who were reported to be experiencing received some type of services from Adult Protective Services. Next slide. So why is all of this important? Financial health impacts overall health. Research has shown that victims of elder abuse are 3 times more likely to die than people who've not experienced maltreatment within a 3-year period of time after experiencing it. So there's a significant health impact there. And for older adults, people who are beyond their earnings years or significantly beyond their earnings years, the financial losses can be devastating. Financial exploitation frequently leaves people without the ability to pay for the necessities of life, food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and it's really difficult to make those losses up. It's also important to remember that over half of individuals age 55 and over have less than $50,000 in savings and investments. So the theft from financial exploitation doesn't have to be huge for it to be devastating. If you have $50,000 in savings and someone steals $25,000 from you to pay for their new car, they've stolen half of your net worth. It'd take a lot more than that to have the same impact on, Warren Buffett. Next slide, please. There are vulnerability factors that contribute. I've always said criminals and people who commit elder abuse I view as criminals, although frequently they're family members, like easy victims. Social isolation, if you look at the definitions and the risk factors for various forms of abuse, social isolation, keeping the person from having contact with others is a common trait. It pops up time and time again. Sometimes the social isolation is imposed by the abuser, and sometimes it's self-imposed. It's just a matter of circumstances where the person is no longer able to travel and get out and have the social contact and involvement that they've had. Bereavement, dependence on others to provide care, that dependence creates a great vulnerability for abuse. Certainly caregiver neglect, and financial exploitation, the financial responsibility to care for another person, drug and alcohol use or abuse, and depression or mental illness. Next slide. A decline in capacity is also a risk factor. There was a study by the Penn Memory Center and another similar facility in the last couple of years. A study was published this last summer that credit scores on average start to decline 7 years before a person is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. They pulled together a large number of people, it was around 500 people who'd been recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and with their permission, pulled their credit histories. And a credit score is a reflection of collections and judgments, credit utilization, and timeliness of payment. And they found that on average, that measure of financial ability started to decline 7 years before a person was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So it's something that starts to happen a long time before anyone else notices it. Most common symptom, the canary in the coal mine for someone who's had a decline in capacity, is unpaid bills. And this happened with my parents. They came home from lunch one day and the lights had been turned off because my mother hadn't paid the electric bill in 3 months. And there wasn't money in the checking account. There was plenty of money on hand. She just couldn't understand that bill needed to be paid again and again and again every month. And that's really the most common pattern that we see. And for most families, it's what sets off the alarm bells that someone's having difficulty in managing money or finances. And at that point, that person becomes very susceptible to abuse. Unusual spending is less common. As I was preparing this slide, someone emailed me a news story out of the Northeast of a person who apparently was experiencing some issues with cognitive impairment, and her car was in the shop. I think it was actually in the body shop to repair from an accident. And she was strolling through social media one evening and an ad popped up for a car dealership, and click here and buy this red Ford pickup truck. I actually found a picture of a red Ford pickup truck. And she clicked buy now and entered her credit card information and went to bed and forgot about what she'd done. And a day or two later, the car dealer rang her doorbell and said, "Hi, ma'am, we're here to deliver your new truck." She didn't remember buying it. That's rarer. It does happen. And I have seen it where people spent their way through a large life savings, a multi-million-dollar life savings, without understanding the impact and the long-term consequences of the choices that they were making. That is less common, but it does happen. And we should be aware if an older person starts to go on a spending spree of double checking to make sure that they understand what they're doing and that what they're doing consciously. Next slide. There are some physiological factors in aging. Now, normal aging and disease contribute to an adult's vulnerability. Normal aging includes changes in physical ability, eyesight, and hearing. An increased likelihood of dependence on others, and dependence on others also increases vulnerability. It's really hard to resist someone else if you're dependent on that person for care. And then neurological changes, mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and changes in executive cognitive functions. Estimates are about 35% of persons over the age of 71 have at least mild cognitive impairment, which makes them more likely to have errors and less risk averse, more likely to take on high risk investments, or casino gambling is something else that we do see happening with folks that are experiencing changes in cognitive ability. So those are risk factors that are there. Next slide. Depression, estimates are as high as 20% of older adults have major depressive disorder or measurable depression. And it's a risk factor for adults who tend to be abused. People who are depressed are easier to abuse, and people that are abused tend to become more depressed. So it's kind of a vicious cycle at that point, in that the depression creates a vulnerability, and then the abuse deepens the cycle of the depression. Next slide. Changes in financial capacity. We just recently updated a publication that we do on assessing capacity. There's been a huge amount of research in the last decade on capacity and the ability to execute, to make and execute financial decisions consistent with long-term values and preferences. And this shows a U-shaped pattern with a peak in performance at age 53, which those of us that are, well, almost a decade past that start to look at it and go, oh, you mean my financial ability peaked a decade ago? But the research shows that it did. And it gets down to the point of older adults not being able to realize the consequences, the long term, and many older adults that are experiencing changes in financial capacity have reached the point where they don't understand what's happening. The assessment on this now starts with changes in being able to do routine everyday math, addition, subtraction, changes in understanding financial concepts, the difference between a 5% interest rate and an 18% interest rate on a credit card. Do they understand, where are they able to understand the impact of that difference? The ability to understand routine financial documents, billing statements. When they get the credit card bill in the mail, can they find how much I owe? What's the total balance owed, and what's the minimum payment due? Because people lose the ability to do this. In healthcare, we get a lot of comments from healthcare providers that folks that are experiencing changes in memory and cognition get that explanation of benefits form that shows the total amount billed, the amount that was allowed, the amount paid by the insurance, the amount that you might be responsible for, and they're totally confused as to which number they need to write a check for. And that's something that we see. So those are various stages of this, along with not understanding the risk factors that are involved. And Judy will talk about securities. There's exploitation that happens because of changes in the ability to understand the risk factors. Next slide. Undue influence. Financial exploiters, and they can be family members, strangers, overcome the will or the normal decision-making process of the person by exerting undue influence. There's really 4 factors for this. If we can go to the next slide. California probably has the best undue influence screening tool that's out there. This is on the online from Elder Justice California. Was developed based on California specific law. So if you're going to use this in another state, you'll want to work with the lawyers in your state to make sure that it's specific to the elements in your state. But it looks at the vulnerability of the client. And this screening tool then gives a checklist down the one side there of various factors that might contribute to vulnerability. On to the next slide. It looks at the influencer in a position of authority or power. Are they a family member? Are they a caregiver? Do they have professional standing? Do they have legal authority? Do they have some lever of authority over the person? Access to the person and their documents, access to private information. So we have vulnerability, person in a position of power or authority, a person in a position of influence. Next slide. Do they take action to forward that? Actions or tactics to leverage that influence to get what they want. And there's a checklist of things there, and you could personalize that to the community that you're working in, the population you're working with, and any differences in state law. And next slide is an unfair or improper outcome. So these are complex factors, are really, really good. The next slide shows a summary of those 4 elements. The victim appears to be vulnerable. There is a suspected influencer that does appear to be in a position of power or authority. They've taken steps to exert their undue influence, and the influencers' actions appear to have resulted in an unfair outcome. The next slide goes through 4 unique definitions. Financial exploitation is the unauthorized use or taking of the money or property of a vulnerable adult for the benefit of another person. In virtually every state, when you look at the elder abuse definitions or adult abuse definitions, vulnerability is a factor, and vulnerability is defined by state law. Most commonly, it's some limitation on the ability to protect oneself from harm. And that vulnerability can be based on a physical limitation or a mental or an emotional limitation, a cognitive limitation, but there's some level of vulnerability built into that. Lack of capacity is theft from a person who's unable to form or to give or deny informed consent. And this is really just an outright theft. But if you can prove in a legal action a lack of capacity, the person didn't know what they were doing when they signed that check, or when that car, when their car was stolen from them and driven away, taken from them and driven away, you've met the burden of proof for a claim of lack of capacity. Undue influence is the exertion of influence over a vulnerable adult with the intent to override or change their choice or free will of the person for the benefit of another person. And fraud is a theft involving an intentional lie or material misstatement of fact with the intent that the person will rely on that for the benefit of another person. On the next slide, we have a summary of these that shows where they overlap and where they're different. All of them have in common the theft or use of the money and property of another person, of the person for the benefit of another person. For financial exploitation, you need vulnerability. You don't need a person in a position of power or influence. It's sometimes a stranger. And you don't need a material lie for financial exploitation to take place. For lack of capacity, you've got vulnerability to the extent that the person is unable to form informed consent. For undue influence, the person must have capacity because we're overriding their normal resistance to making a choice. but you need some vulnerability, but not to the level of a lack of capacity. You need a person in a position of influence. You don't need a material lie or misstatement. In fact, the most common undue influence scenario that we see is, if you don't sign the check so that I can have the pretty little red Ferrari, I'll drop you off at the nearest nursing home and you'll never see your grandkids again. And the checks get signed. Now, it's usually not a red Ferrari. It's more likely to be the red Ford pickup truck. But undue influence is exerted in a lot of family situations with those very simple threats. A fraud always involves an intentional lie or material misstatement of fact with the expectation that the person is going to rely on it, that results in a theft or a loss of money or property for the benefit of another. Next slide. Screening for financial exploitation is related but different than screening for capacity. Most victims don't voluntarily disclose that they've been financially exploited. In fact, as someone that worked a legal aid office for a decade, most of the financial exploitation calls that came in started out with, I need help paying my rent, I need help paying my utility bills, how can I get help with paying my prescription drug copays? They came in as financial need questions, and you had to dig into it and talk about the income and what the person's expenses were and add it up and go, okay, how come there's not enough money left at the end of the month to pay the gas bill? Persons with capacity are victimized by undue influence or just outright theft, and diminished capacity increases risk. And apparently research shows that exploitation in the past or the present increases a future risk of a re-victimization or additional exploitation taking place. Next slide. We do publish a handbook on this. It's aimed at lawyers, but others would probably find it quite helpful. The second edition was published this year. The American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging and the American Psychological Association put this together. It was the first update in about 12 or 13 years and a significant step forward in assessing capacity. Next slide. Capacity in and of itself is hard to define because, and we'll talk about it, there are a lot of factors that are involved. But informed consent is easier. Informed consent is an agreement by a person to a proposed course of conduct after adequate information and explanation about risks and benefits, reasonably available alternatives of the proposed course of action. And that's a much more concrete definition than you'll find for capacity. Next slide. Capacity is the ability to make that informed choice or decision. Next slide. Capacity is a spectrum, and we're all someplace on that spectrum for every decision or choice that we're making, someplace between comatose and genius. Hopefully we're closer to genius than we are to comatose, but we're all there someplace. And it'll change. Next slide. Capacity is situational. I can drive the car, but I can't fly the dirigible. Now, I might be able to fly the dirigible if there were a good flight instructor showing me exactly what to do. But the fact that I can drive the car doesn't mean that I can fly the dirigible. The fact that I can't fly an airplane doesn't mean I can't drive a car. Now, that's a ridiculous example, but we see people time and time again that say, this person can't make decisions because they can't decide X. Well, that means they can't decide X. It doesn't mean that other questions, other issues, they might not, that they're unable to decide other issues. So it's very situational or task specific. It's also transient. It comes and it goes. Next slide. Capacity is impacted by medical conditions, and there's a laundry list there of various infections, dehydration, delirium, that's confusion, disorientation, agitation, frequently anger, very much mimics dementia or mental illness. And there was a study that came out in the AMA journal recently that showed 30% of persons aged 70 and over that were hospitalized for COVID experienced significant symptoms of delirium while hospitalized. It's also generally temporary. When the person's condition stabilizes and their health improves, the delirium normally goes away. Malnutrition, pain, sensory deficits, frequently a lack of capacity is confused with hearing difficulties and vision loss. And there are a lot of accommodations that can be made to accommodate hearing and vision. Medication side effects. I'm the person in the picture with that funny grin on my face. That was shortly after some major spinal surgery a few years ago. And I had really good news and really bad news. The really good news is the pain medication was incredibly effective. They kept me very comfortable through what could have been a very difficult time in my life. The bad news is they gave my phone back to me the day after surgery, and I started sending emails and text messages. And you go back and you read those, and it's very clear that something was impacting my normal ability to be rational, to make informed choices. When the pain meds went away, the capacity came back. At least I hope it did. Psychological conditions, stress, grief, depression, disorientation, lack of sleep. The latest revision of the handbook also recognizes that stereotypes and cultural barriers, including language and bias, are also mistaken often for a lack of capacity. Next slide. Screening for financial exploitation. Anyone could do this. The tools that we're going to show were developed specifically for financial services industry. But if you look at them and think about it, there are things that are fairly easy to do by asking friendly questions and showing a genuine interest in the person. Next slide. This is a tool that was created for lawyers to screen for financial exploitation. It's a person accompanied by a stranger, family member, someone who seems especially interested. Accusations of family members, banking activity that's erratic, uncharacteristic, or inconsistent with ability. You know, people who are homebound that are withdrawing $100 a day out of the ATM should raise a red flag. Carrying financial documents around all the time. Changes in property titles, concern and confusion about missing funds, confusion about documents that they've signed or haven't signed. So things to ask about, and there's a laundry list there, and there's a link on that slide. The next slide, please. And that carries over onto a second page. You can find that link. We'll share the slide deck with you all. Click on that and it'll take you to where this is at. Suddenly stops receiving mail, particularly bills, suspicious activity on credit cards, financial accounts, unsuitable investments due to risk or age of the client. Next slide, please. Some background screening questions. Who makes decisions about your money or property? How do you get cash when you need it? Does anyone have access to your bank account? Have you noticed any suspicious or unusual items on your bills? Have you noticed money missing from your accounts? Does anyone else live with you? Did you want the person that came with you to this appointment to come with you to this appointment? So there's a good series of questions there. Next slide. Another set of screening tools, and again, there's a link at the bottom there. This is a list that I did for National Center on Law and Elder Rights a couple of years ago. How often do you see or talk with family or friends? Is there anyone you don't trust who makes you feel uncomfortable? If you received paperwork in the mail or delivered to your door is a red flag for lawyers. Because that's how lawsuits get delivered. Has anyone hurt you, called you names, treated you poorly? Again, simple screening tools of questions you can and should ask. Next slide. Okay. Adults have a right to make bad decisions. That's a picture of me again. I have a right to make bad decisions. Buying a convertible was a really silly idea. I owned a nice, sensible, practical car. I still do. And then I have the car that barely holds two people. Mr. Panda only fits in the back seat because his legs are squishy. It has no trunk space. It drips a little bit when it rains. It gets terrible gas mileage. It's expensive to maintain. And as an adult, it's not in my best interest. And it was a really bad decision, but I absolutely love that car. I love taking it out on a pretty morning, putting the top down and taking a nice drive and letting what's left of my hair blow in the breeze. And as an adult, I'm allowed to do that. Why do we prohibit older adults from doing the same thing that we allow ourselves to do? If they understand the risks, the benefits, the consequences of the choice that they're making, it's a valid choice, even if it's a bad decision or not in their best interest. And yet we see families intervene and try to stop people's freedom of choice and ability to make choices based on the fact that it's a bad choice or not in their best interest. So Martin and Lauren, do we have any questions?
Not as of right now, no.
Okay, and I will hang on, and if we have questions at the end, I'll take them then, and I'll hand off to Judy.
And just before we start with Judy, I wanted to continue the introduction for her. Along with being serving as the Securities Administrator for the State of Maine Office of Securities, having been appointed in 2008, she's also the co-chair of the Maine Council for Elder Abuse Prevention, a coalition of public and private partners dedicated to preventing elder abuse in all its forms. Judy was appointed by Governor Janet Mills to serve as public sector co-chair of the Elder Abuse Coordinating Partnership, an advisory committee established by executive order and tasked with creating an elder justice roadmap for Maine. A past president of the North American Securities Administrators Association, Judy previously served as chair of the Senior Issues and Diminished Capacity Committee, as well as the Enforcement Section Committee. And I will now hand this off to Judy and look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. When I see this slide that says elder investment fraud and state securities regulation, I think, why should you be interested in this? And I think the easy answer is it is so important to discuss all possible components of elder abuse or abuse of any vulnerable adult, because my experience has been that financial exploitation does not travel alone. More often than not, particularly if the alleged perpetrator is a known and trusted individual to the victim, this elder abuse, this financial exploitation, this investment fraud is not going to travel alone. It's going to be traveling with some other form of abuse, including self-neglect. Next slide, please. I'm going to touch just ever so briefly on the role of state securities regulators. Every state has one. New York has the wonderful Peter Pope, the bureau chief for the New York Investor Protection Bureau within the Office of the New York Attorney General. In our great state of Maine, we have our Office of Securities. What is our role? We like to call ourselves the cops on the beat. We are protecting Main Street investors. We are here in Maine to assist all 1.3 million people here in the state of Maine with any problems that they have regarding investment fraud and to make wise and informed decisions about their investments. Next slide, please. When I talk about financial fraud and financial exploitations, I often use this spectrum. On one end, we see unknown scam artists. This gentleman is was a popular Jamaican disc jockey, most popularly known as ZJ Wawa, and one of the people behind the infamous Jamaican lottery scam. Mary Jo Frazier is also identified there, and in a few minutes I will talk about a case study that involved her. On the far end, we see family members and caregivers, and as David's already identified, unfortunately, we can find that trusted family members and caregivers can commit financial fraud, financial exploitation, and other forms of abuse, often seen as inappropriate use or misuse of powers of attorney, theft, and exertion of undue influence, which David covered very nicely. And in the middle, we also have unscrupulous financial professionals. We have a picture here of Bernie Madoff and Jordan Belfort, the infamous Wolf of Wall Street. So I will talk about these various areas along the financial fraud as we move along through our presentation. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, investment fraud, the thing I would add to David's definition of fraud is that in addition to there being an intentional lie or misstatement of a fact, it can be the omission of a material fact in the investment world. Is there a material fact that's necessary for people to know in order for them to make a fully informed decision? That choice that David was talking about, whether it's a good choice or a bad choice, ultimately it needs to be an informed choice. So if that information is withheld, that can also form a basis for investment or securities fraud. Investment fraud can take many forms. David mentioned unsuitable investments. We often see that there can be some very high risk investments sold to individuals who are at a phase in their life where they're going to need to be utilizing that accumulated wealth. So should a financial professional be selling to someone who is the age of 90 an illiquid investment, something that they will not be able to get money out of should they have medical needs or housing needs? Fraudulent offerings, we see offerings that truly don't even exist, but they sound wonderful and they're able to get people to invest in those offerings. In our criminal cases, in particular, we see the next three: the sale of unregistered securities by an unlicensed individual or firm, and then theft or misapplication or misappropriation of the funds that are received. We saw, for example, one criminal case that we handled involved a gentleman by the name of Robert Howarth, who convinced a number of retirees in the state of Maine to give him hundreds of thousands of dollars for a fake designer clothing importation business. And of course, he was advised that it was a security, it needed to be registered. He disagreed. We told him he needed to be licensed. He disagreed. Scam artists often don't think that they have to comply with regulatory requirements. It was enough for us to look into it more closely, and Mr. Howarth was indeed prosecuted, found guilty, and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Next slide, please. I'm not going to touch in detail on all of these common types of investment fraud, but I do want to highlight a couple. Affinity fraud is a very important type of fraud to be aware of. This is where the promoters behind the fraud are going to try to find some connection with the people that they want to approach, our potential victims. We often see this around faith-based communities. Certainly Bernie Madoff was using some of his connections within the Jewish communities to perpetrate his fraud. We certainly have seen it a number of times in Christian communities, but it doesn't just have to be faith-based communities. We have seen it with the deaf community here in Maine, unfortunately, as well. And we see it with veterans. Anywhere that they can convince you that there is this relationship, this connection, it creates some credibility and a sense of trust. Theft in brokerage accounts or other investment accounts, that's that middle sector, the unscrupulous financial professional that I was mentioning. And I will give you a case study on that in a few minutes. Internet, social media, email investment scams, technology is a double-edged sword. It opens the door to global fraud, global exploitation of individuals, particularly for those individuals who may not be as comfortable with and as savvy with technology and all of its pros and cons. Ponzi and pyramid schemes are things that I think we are all probably familiar with. Certainly Robert Howarth that I mentioned previously was indeed a Ponzi scheme, bringing in investors early on, making sure they were getting a certain level of return so that they could then bring in other friends and family members into the scheme until it finally collapsed because Mr. Howarth was not able to bring in more investors and more money to be able to continue to keep up that facade of a legitimate scheme. Oil and gas schemes, we always see coins and precious metals. We see a lot of that. That particularly targets elderly populations. Some of the precious metal scams that we have seen recently were specifically targeting individuals age 85 and older. And I think one of our oldest victims was 110. Next slide, please. So some warning signs that we like to make sure everybody is aware of. Certainly a promise of no risk or a very low risk with high rewards or returns, and especially if they use the term guarantee. Be very, very careful. Keep in mind that a high rate of return means a high risk. Those two go together. Low risk, really high return, they don't match together. And nothing in life is guaranteed at all. There's no guarantee I'm going to safely make it out of my bed and into the kitchen to make coffee tomorrow morning. So we need to keep that in mind. Spelling and grammatical errors, if you're receiving or your customers or clients are receiving emails, text messages, letters in the mail that have spelling and grammatical errors, big red flag. It's either going to be from a scam artist or perhaps a young person, maybe teenager or a child, and you probably don't want to invest with either one of them. There are also these schemes that rely on high pressure sales tactics or try to make you feel like you are special. We've talked about affinity fraud, the idea that this is only for you or a select group that we are members of. You have to be a veteran in order to be able to invest in this particular program or scheme. High pressure sales tactics. Easy way to describe this. Think about if anyone remembers Billy Mays being on television and touting, but wait, there's more. Or if you watch one of the home shopping channels, perfectly legitimate tactics, but they're tactics that get used by scam artists as well. Scarcity, there's only 3 left, hurry up, look at the clock ticking down in the corner. We have to make sure that we do not fall prey to these high pressure sales tactics. The next group I think we see most frequently with financial professionals, give me cash or make a check out to me personally, not to the broker dealer firm. Don't make the check out to Edward Jones, make it out to me. Promises to provide paperwork later. If I say, oh, could I have copies of that paperwork? Well, I'll email it to you later. And then oftentimes we find our victims do not receive the paperwork, or even worse, asking you to sign blank forms or documents. Just sign here, I'll fill in the information later. And sometimes we have seen that the information that gets filled in is filled in a way that supports a bad sale or purchase that the financial professional suggested, or gave the financial professional, in some cases, access to funds that they should not have access to. Equally important is to make sure that if you want to speak to a supervisor, if the individual is saying, no, you just can't seem to speak with anyone who is in a different position within the company, that's another red flag. And then of course we always have, if an offer is too good to be true, it probably is. Next slide, please. There are lots of different ways that investment frauds and scams come into our homes. It can be text messages, it can be emails. The Nigerian prince, believe it or not, is still around. We still have victims of the Nigerian prince scam. Work from home programs. My own mother, when she was alive, one of the early signs that she had some cognitive issues was that she fell prey to a work from home scam that said, if you allow us to withdraw X dollars from your account each month, we will set up a website, and every time someone accesses that website, you will get your money back plus a significant rate of return. Foreign lotteries, People probably don't understand oftentimes that it's actually not legal in the United States to play a foreign lottery. So we find if we explain that to our victims, they understand that quickly. All of the telephone calls, the phony websites, we are bombarded, and the people we care about are bombarded daily with all of these messages trying to convince us to go ahead and invest in things that simply are not legitimate. Next slide, please. So I have a few case studies I'd like to share with you. I know I could talk about all of these concepts, but I find that sometimes it's easier to talk about some facts. And this particular case study involves Mary Jo Frazier. Her picture was on my spectrum earlier. So this case study involves a scam that was called Profitable Sunrise, and it was an affinity fraud. It was a social media-based affinity fraud. And what was done through social media was contacting and trying to reach out to individuals who identified as being part of the Christian faith. The individuals behind Profitable Sunrise said that they too were Christians. And if you simply give us X amount of money on Easter when the sun rises, you will get all of your money back plus a significant neighborhood of 400% return on your investment in the form of Visa cards. The reason I mentioned Mary Jo Frazier is that sometimes what scam artists do is they pull in individuals who have credibility in our states and our communities. And Mary Jo was one of those individuals. They pulled her in, they paid her to help promote the scam on the ground. The fact of the matter is the scam artists weren't located in the United States at all. They moved their servers elsewhere. Fortunately, securities regulators at both state, federal, and provincial levels in Canada came together to bring down Profitable Sunrise, and the scam collapsed. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about a case that involved a financial professional. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but these are some of the things that we see, those unsuitable investments that I mentioned. We do see some power of attorney abuse, sometimes with unscrupulous financial professionals. Complex investments, make sure that you and your financial professional can clearly describe and that you both understand complex investments. When we go out and do examinations of financial professionals, if we see that they are selling complex or alternative products, we will ask them to describe to us what that product is all about and how it works. And if they can't, then there's a serious question in our mind whether they should be selling it. And watch out for those high fees and expenses. Make sure to ask questions and make sure that you're getting the answers to those questions. Next slide, please. So this case study I want to tell you about is the most recent criminal case that we prosecuted here in Maine, prosecuted successfully. And it's the case of Robert Kenneth Lindell. Mr. Lindell was a longtime stockbroker, financial professional, trusted financial professional here in Maine, and a former state legislator. Mr. Lindell managed to convince an elderly widow on the coast of Maine. He had been the financial professional for her husband. When her husband passed away, Mr. Lindell realized that she had inherited a fair amount of money. She was relatively socially isolated, one of the factors that David mentioned previously. Her children all resided outside of the state of Maine, and she didn't have a lot of close friends, although she did have a couple of trusted friends. And so he moved in and filled that gap. The widow passed away and left behind a trust fund specifically for her disabled veteran son who was in a facility in Florida. Our other victim was a widow in France. Mr. Lindell was born in France, and the widow in France knew him from the day he was born. She was his mother's best friend. Her husband left her a trust when he died, and the trust document said, "I leave this trust to care for my beloved." Mr. Lindell ultimately, we alleged, and he was found guilty of misappropriating $3.5 million from the Trust for the Disabled Veteran Son and the Trust for the Widow in France. He argued that the $3.5 million represented appropriate fees for the services he provided in managing the trust account and in providing financial services. However, he never claimed them, those fees, the alleged fees, as income. He used the money to fly around the world, to support his lavish lifestyle, to purchase a home in California wine country for himself and his family. And as I said, he was ultimately found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 10 years in Maine State Prison. Next slide, please. Family members and caregivers. It is a sad fact that this is part of my financial fraud spectrum. And as David was mentioning, we often see this represented by way of exertion of undue influence, abuse of powers of attorney. Powers of attorney are very interesting because people often say, I'm my mother's power of attorney. And I chuckle a little bit because unless you're a piece of paper, you are not a power of attorney. You are your mother's agent under that power of attorney, which means you're responsible for doing what makes the most sense and what is in the best interest of your mother. Maine has an improvident transfer statute. And if we could look at the next slide, this next case study will talk about that a little bit. So in this case, I happened to receive a call one day from one of our investment advisory firms here in Maine, from a gentleman who ran that firm. And he said, I have a client and I don't know how to help her. I asked what the problem was, and what he said was his client, who he had been providing services to for a very long time, was a resident of Connecticut. Her son and daughter-in-law moved to Maine some years prior. And over the years, as happens to all of us, all of her friends passed away, and she was sort of in Connecticut by herself. Her son called her one day and said, Mom, you know, you should be up here in Maine with us, with your grandson. You'll be able to spend more time, and we'll be able to take care of you. You can come to Maine, we'll buy a piece of property, we'll build a home, and we'll all live together, and it will be wonderful. And so she did, except when she got to Maine, she purchased the property and she paid to have a home built. And because none of us know how long we are going to be on this earth, her son died unexpectedly. And 2 days after the funeral, her daughter-in-law, because they had convinced Mom to deed the property over to the son and daughter-in-law, her daughter-in-law was evicting her. And so the advisor said, this client has called me, she's being evicted. I don't know what to do to help her. Well, what we did was help him get her connected with Maine Legal Services for the Elderly, a wonderful, wonderful organization we're very privileged to have here in Maine that provides wonderful legal services free of charge to Maine residents age 60 and older. And what Maine Legal Services for the Elderly was able to do was to find her temporary housing, and they were able to stop that eviction, and they were able to use Maine's improvident transfer law to get her home back for her. I mentioned this case for lots of different reasons, but not the least of which to say the extent to which we can build those types of partnerships to make sure that we know what resources are available so that we can take a holistic approach to caring for individuals who are vulnerable and find that they've been exploited, the far better off we and our families and friends and neighbors are going to be. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about a few things that we can do either for ourselves or our family, friends, neighbors, customers, clients, to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves. And certainly reducing our exposure is helpful. Certainly if we receive a call that is a scam, blocking those calls, one of the biggest things that we can do to help. Be skeptical. Ask questions if it sounds like it's maybe there's some question about the legitimacy of a potential investment. Don't do it, and slow down. It is so very important that we don't allow potential scam artists and perpetrators to get us into our hearts. If we think about the grandparent scam, for example, why is that so successful? because any one of us who receives a phone call that sounds like a family member that is in trouble, we are immediately going to get into our heart and say, I will do anything to take care of them and protect them. The scam artists have a name for this. They call it getting us into the ether. And so if they can get us out of our head and into our heart, we're going to run as fast as we can down to Walgreens to purchase those gift cards that they want us to purchase, instead of calling that grandson or granddaughter's parents to say, oh my gosh, where's Billy? I just got a call and he said he was arrested in Mexico. If we made that call, we would probably find out that Billy's in the basement playing with the Xbox. Next slide, please. Make sure to create a paper trail. This is so important, especially if you're working with professionals. Sometimes we find that we have investors who have wonderful paper documents and the financial professional has nothing. And so that is going to help support and lend credibility to the story that we are hearing from the investor. Ask questions. My favorite thing to say about this is when Bernie Madoff had his first jailhouse interview when he went to prison, the reporter asked him, did you ever turn anybody away? And Mr. Madoff's response was, only if they asked too many questions. And so I always like to say, when you think you have asked your last question, think of another question to ask and make sure you're getting legitimate answers to those questions. And finally, if you get a call from somebody that is clearly a scam artist, and if they're calling you about a car warranty for sure, just hang up. It's okay. Nobody will fault us for that. Frankly, I do not answer my phone at all unless it is a family member. And even then I tell them I probably won't answer the phone. If it's important, send me an immediate text after you call and make sure you leave a voicemail. Next slide, please. I'll leave you with this for my part. Check it out. If anybody contacts you and says that they want to sell you an investment opportunity, you can reach out to FINRA, you can reach out to our office, reach out to Peter Pope and the great people who work in his bureau in New York. We are there to help provide you information on people. Are they properly registered or licensed? Is what they're selling you a security? Is it properly registered and licensed? So important to use the resources that are available to you. And so while New York operates under a different version of the securities laws than the Maine Uniform Securities Act, the investor protection principles are absolutely the same. And I and all of my colleagues are here to help you, help us accomplish our mission. It is a very simple mission: protect investors, especially those among us who are most vulnerable. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it back to Martin.
Hi, everyone. Okay, first of all, I think we should ask, do we have any questions at this time? Lauren, do we have any questions?
We have one. I would say it's more of a comment that I can definitely share. One attendee stated, I find many of my seniors have no money due to donations, saying it's only $10. But $10 sometimes is more, maybe 20 times every month. It's a lot of money. Why isn't anything being done to shut these so-called charities down? They're stealing from seniors legally every single day. They inundate our seniors' mailboxes every day. It makes me sick.
I think that's a wonderful comment, and I share the sentiment. I also know with my own mother that one of the challenges with perfectly legitimate charities is you make a donation and very quickly, within a couple of months, you're getting another request for a donation. And what my mother believed, because she had dementia, was that they never received her first check. So before we knew it, a very simple $25 donation became a $250 donation over time, because every time she made a donation, soon there was another solicitation. It is a very challenging balancing act, and I'm not quite sure. I agree that it needs to be addressed. I don't have an answer. It is a very difficult balancing act, because certainly legitimate nonprofits, that's the best way for them to be able to get the support that they need in order to carry on their own mission. But I do believe it's a problem that needs to be addressed, particularly for people who have cognitive challenges.
And just to follow up on that, I know there was recently a political scam where people were being asked to make a donation of $50 or $100, and all of a sudden $3,000 later, and the person who made the donation was a cancer patient, ended up losing all this money. Now, I don't know what happened with that political fraud that was going on, but again, that may be, I think it may have been in New York State. One question that if Lauren, do you have other questions? Because I have a few.
We do just have a couple more right now in the Q&A. Okay. One participant, just to say it out loud, asked, will the presentation be shared? And I did, David, I heard you say that you were okay with the slide deck being shared, so I can certainly do that. I can send it out to everyone who attended today. And then the next question that we received is, do you recommend, and obviously this could be addressed by any one of you, do you recommend reporting suspicious elder abuse, financial exploitation to several agencies such as federal, state, and local? So your recommendations regarding reporting.
My answer to that would be report early and often. It's very difficult sometimes to substantiate, but sometimes multiple reporting to the Securities regulator and to Adult Protective Services and the local police and the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. If 4 or 5 people are looking at it, maybe somebody will find the critical piece of evidence that they need to substantiate a case and be able to move forward. The federal agencies like Federal Trade Commission and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have to look for a pattern. So they need 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 reports of the same extended car warranty scam. They call me 2 or 3 times every day in order for them to be able to document what they need to move forward, because their investment authority, their investigative or enforcement authority on the national level is generally based on large scale rather than individual cases. And they may not be getting the cross reports from Adult Protective Services or the local or state level agencies. Judy, anything to add?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that David said. And I would just add, don't be afraid to do repeat reporting, because if there's not enough information the first time, that evidence can build on itself. In the state of Maine, I can't unfortunately speak to New York, but I can tell you in the state of Maine, we've worked really hard to develop partnerships, and we say we use a no wrong door approach. So those partnerships, if someone reports to Adult Protective Services, if it belongs in my office, it will get referred to me. But if those reports are made simultaneously, we can quickly circle the wagons and come together as a collective team and bring in legal services for the elderly if appropriate, and bring in law enforcement or our Bureau of Consumer Credit Protection to try to address any potential identity theft issues that might be involved. So those collaborations are just critical.
At this point, if I can mention, because it was actually, this ties into something I wanted to ask, which is, so often we see something go on and we think to ourselves, well, it's none of my business, or we're being told to mind our own business. But let's say any of us are at a bank and we see a mother, son, mother, daughter, whatever, but it looks like the mother's being a little sheepish. So they're at the teller window, and every time the teller asks a question, the child answers, not the parent. And you're watching this, and it's just, there's a flag going up that there's something not right. And yet you're saying, on the other hand, it's none of your business. What do you do to get over your personal trying to be polite, or not wanting to get involved, or wanting to get involved and not knowing how to do it without making a situation worse, especially if that scenario involves somebody who, if the child may also be physically abusive when not in public, and you have to worry about them going back home and dealing with that nightmare. So now that I've teed that up for you, Judy, I think that's one that I see you shaking your head on that one. What should I do in that case?
Well, it's certainly very difficult for us as individuals if we just happen to be in the financial institution and we see that, the senior safe training that was launched in the state of Maine in 2014 to train financial professionals in financial institutions, particularly tellers and customer service folks on those red flags. It brought to mind a specific scenario, Martin, actually, where a teller recognized that scenario, a gentleman and his partner, and the partner was just going at him and they were arguing, and she dragged him out of the financial institution. That teller, I learned, thought to call the state, and I received a message from the vice president of the bank who said, because I had just done senior safe training for the bank, thank you for the training. The teller used the red flags, and this week the man came back in to thank her profusely for making the call to the state, because unbeknownst to him, he had an infection and was suffering serious seizures, which were frustrating his girlfriend. And she had brought him to the bank to withdraw all of his money and give it to her. And when the state, law enforcement and APS showed up, they got him to the ER and he was told that he was within 24 hours of dying. So I like to say that if there is no better reason to help people, it is because truly you can save a life.
Yeah. And all states have elder abuse reporting laws, and all of them have mandatory reporters, but all of them also allow permissive reporting. If I saw somebody in the bank, I probably wouldn't know enough about to file. I might not know enough about the person to report to APS, because I live in a big city and I don't know my neighbors. I don't know the person who lives next door to me. But if it were a next door neighbor or a friend and somebody that I knew, and I saw that, permissive reporting is allowed by anyone who has a reasonable belief or suspicion that abuse, neglect, or exploitation is taking place. I've got a friend of mine in the Midwest who's working on a large elder abuse, financial exploitation, marriage fraud case. They're trying to annul a marriage. And there were 7 different reports filed with Adult Protective Services and law enforcement before they were able to substantiate what was going on to a level where they were able to bring legal action to intervene to try to help the person who was being mistreated.
I could jump in here with another question. I'm going a little bit out of order of the questions we're getting in the chat, only because this does relate directly to reporting to APS. One participant stated, I struggle with APS because often when I am reporting, the customer doesn't want to admit that they have been exploited, so APS cannot do anything to stop the abuse. I see this happen most with family members. I understand the position of APS, but what can we do to help those folks?
David, and I have thoughts, but
Yeah, an adult with the ability to understand the choice that they're making can make bad choices. And it's really difficult for the law to try to intervene, even if outsiders look at it and go, this person's being taken advantage of, unless the person says, I'm being taken advantage of, please help me. And that's frequently what happens there. It's not just a matter of whether the person is willing to admit it. If the person has the ability to understand that someone is taking advantage of them and stealing their money or property, and they understand that that's happening, it can be legally, it becomes difficult to intervene. It really becomes more of a social services intervention, a social work intervention, than it does a legal intervention. Judy?
I think the point that I want to make, all of that is absolutely right. And it does go back to our free will. which we certainly have the right to exercise. But the point I would like to make is for those of us who care so deeply about these issues and care so deeply about the people we want to help, we have to remember that we also need to care for ourselves. So by knowing and understanding what resources are available to help that individual, perhaps if the APS report isn't going to help, are there other community-based resources that you could help make available to that individual? At some point, we need to understand and be kind to ourselves that we have taken every measure we can possibly take, and be confident and comfortable in that, so that we can still have the energy to help the next person who is going to be brought to our doorstep.
Can I work with that we'll go back to the question about repeated charitable donations. Can I work with that person and go, let me help you organize your money and finances? Would you with your permission, let me help. Let's make sure that your utility bills and your groceries are paid first. And then we'll look at what charitable donations we can make. And we'll sit down and talk, and we can decide left over at the end of the month. That type of a support role is something that family and friends and neighbors can offer to do, and hopefully at some point, and sometimes the entree is, oh, I see you're having difficulty writing checks. Let me help you fill them out, and you sign them. And it gives you an entree to get in and start talking with the person and helping in that way. It needs to be voluntary unless the person lacks capacity. Adult Protective Services and the police can't force help unless they have reason to believe that the person is unable to understand what's happening.
And part of the problem, from what I have seen, being involved in these various things through this group and others, is you have a certain subset of seniors who have decided that they are too proud, or they're not the one, they don't need the protection because they have it all together. And in some ways, I think they could be the ripest of victims as a result. I'm just curious if you two agree with that, because they just, and we both know probably some mutual friends among the three of us who say, well, I'm 85, but I'm certainly aware of myself. What do I need to worry about this for? So,
yeah.
And
if we urge oversight and accountability, and things like financial oversight have become very, very easy. I was on a call recently with a head of elder services for one of the largest banks in the United States, and they refer to it as read-only online access, and they love doing it. So if with my permission, they'll let Martin and Judy monitor what's happening in my checking account. So there's another set of eyes. They can't transact business on my account. They're not added as account holders. They can't move money out of it. But they're very, very eager to do that, because the financial institutions don't want somebody stealing their clients' money. It leaves their clients unable to pay their bills, and from an investment company, it leaves their clients with no money to invest. And I was very pleased to hear one of the national banks really pursuing the concept of read-only online access. Judy?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, there's more discussion about supported decision-making, which has been around in the, the disability sector for some time. Canada really has used supported decision-making quite effectively. So that, and this concept that I've often heard of from Dr. Bonnie Olson in California about titrating relationships, making sure that early on in our family relationships, we're having conversations, we're building expectations, we're providing clarity about the manner in which we want our future to go as we enter into the different stages of our lives. I prefer to talk about life not in terms of what our age is, but what stage are we in life? Because my retirement stage, frankly, might not arrive until I'm 85 years old, God willing, because I wouldn't quite know what to do with myself otherwise. Some people, my brother included, his retirement stage started when he was 55. So I think I would encourage, if nothing else, let's think about life stages and not ages.
We do have another question in the chat, and I apologize. I appear to be experiencing a little bit of a connection issue, so I may be a few beats behind all of you, and I'm not sure how my audio is. So if you can't hear this question, I'll ask one of our panelists to pull up their Q&A as well, but it looks like we're okay. So the last question in the Q&A for now, but we certainly have time for more. We have until 3:30. A participant asked, what should an older adult do when they give money to a contractor for work to be done, and then they're asked to give more money, or the contractor is not coming to complete the repairs? What can be done in that case?
I can't tell you what the correct answer is for the state of New York, unfortunately, but I can tell you that in the state of Maine, the Consumer Protection Division of our Attorney General's office would handle those types of inquiries. And also people will go to law enforcement. So again, that no wrong door approach, we developed as part of the Maine Council for Elder Abuse Prevention, a two-sided card that lists various types of common scams and who to contact. And so if I had that card in front of me, you would see that those door-to-door contractor, transient seller type scams, we clearly identify the consumer division at the Office of the Attorney General, and we provide the phone number. I don't know the correct answer for New York, but my guess is it's going to be some sort of either county, local, or state consumer protection entity, perhaps.
That's an issue that sometimes crosses the door of a civil legal aid office, of defective contractor work or work that's been started. Certainly a defense is a good place to start there, and part of the defense is getting in writing what's going to be done, how much it's going to cost, how it's going to be paid for, although frequently things are done a little less formally. But the starting point of prevention on that is getting it in writing. Then if the contractor fails to deliver, fails to follow through, comes back and asks for more money than was expected, you have something in writing for the lawyers to work on. Attorneys in private practice, if there's a lot of money involved, I've had friends who've sued contractors for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on work that was not completed, and it had already been paid for. But there is some role for civil litigation on that. The challenge is proving what was agreed to unless you have something in writing. And when you get those contracts, make sure you read through them and the numbers add up. I had some remodeling done a year or so ago, and I was surprised at the math errors in the contract.
And could I just make one more point, Martin, if you don't mind, Lauren? Some of these scams, because we see this as it's a transient seller scam. You see the individuals who do these scams in Maine, it's a transient seller scam. They come in the summer, right? Because you can't do construction year round, and they specifically identify the elderly homeowners. They're not legit contractors at all. They're just transient sellers who are coming from out of state most often. The point I wanted to make is that be aware of the cycles of scams. Romance scams are going to be February around Valentine's Day. They're going to spike. The IRS scam is going to spike around April when tax returns are due. So there's information through lots of different sources. AARP and their Fraud Watch network often will talk about this calendar of scams, this cycle of scams, and the times of year. So for those of you who do education and awareness to try to help us protect ourselves from scams, you can use that as a calendar to post on social media. It's February, watch out, here come the romance scams, that sort of thing.
And by the way, none of us is beyond falling for one of these scams ourselves. I will be perfectly blunt about it and tell you that a couple of years ago, I was very stressed out on other matters, and you get the phone call from the IRS. And I immediately called my accountant, who said, come on, you know about this stuff. I was horrified that as somebody who sees it all the time, my heart skipped a beat when I got that call. But the one thing I want to point also is generationally, and I'll say, let's say anyone over 45 or 50, we have a tendency to be, we have an amazing need to be polite, pick up the phone and say hello. And it's tough to ignore those calls because it's how we were brought up. And you'll have to apologize, my apologies. Except my apologies, my dog is barking right now. But anyhow, so, to me, that's something that we always have to worry about, is that there is that politeness that we all suffer from. I will not pick up a number unless, if somebody has a real problem, they'll leave a message. And even those messages, half the time, are specious. The other thing I want to point out is especially if someone's attending an investor lunch. When my mother was in her 80s, she's gone now, but when my mother was in her 80s, she loved going to these investor lunches, taking the handouts with all the numbers on them, and then quizzing the person in the front of the room saying, but what you're saying doesn't add up to what I'm seeing here on the printed page. And, there were a couple of people, I won't say which state regulators, Judy, but you may know one or two of them, who wanted to hire my mother out as a show, basically, to put these people through their paces and point out to others, you've got to be critical to the extent that you're able to. So part of it's also educating the elderly, and I guess I can put myself in that, I guess anyone over 60, that the scams are real, and you just have to always, I'm not saying that you can't be distrusting of the world, but you have to have sort of an antenna. And the only other thing I want to point out that Judy pointed out was broker check. I don't care how well you know your broker, still go on broker check, because there may be something in there that you'll see that all of a sudden you say, maybe I should be doing business with that person. I'll just give you another quick story on that one, where my mother was on hospice and her stockbroker was calling her twice a week, every week. As a son in the securities industry, I was very concerned about that. I apologize for this. Just got another call, but as a son, I was very concerned, but I went on broker check and I saw the guy was clean. It turned out his mother had died a few months before. So my mother had become a surrogate. So not every broker who's calling your mother when on hospice is necessarily of evil intent. You have to, it's tough to balance it all. And perhaps I'm just making things more complicated, but maybe they are that complicated. So I'm just throwing those couple of things out there for what they're worth.
Well, thank you all. I know we have a couple more minutes left. We don't have any new questions in the Q&A as of this moment. Martin, I'm not sure if there was other questions you had wanted to bring up that we haven't gotten to yet.
I think I've just about covered them as we went through. I do think the affinity group is something that we always have to be careful of, because we always like to be part of our group, our tribe, our, whatever our club is. And unfortunately, in this day and age, it's very easy to get people into a cult-like radicalized setting, even the elderly, and even more so because they're lonely and they want to be part of something.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as someone who's worked for nonprofits for 20 years, there's constantly people calling, wanting to figure out how to get access to our members. And we have to be very rigorous in screening and determining who's legitimate and who's just who we're comfortable doing business with and who we're not. But the secret to all of this on the financial side is oversight, accountability, being careful, being open. People are incredibly private about their money and finances. My spouse doesn't like me looking at the online banking for the second checking account, but somebody needs to. And I'm trying to encourage my spouse to look at my checking account on a regular basis, make sure that I'm suddenly not spending money erratically or making those repeated charitable donations that are not in the current plan. And we want to encourage people to create oversight and accountability. Fraud and financial exploitation frequently occurs in the darkness and in a vacuum. So let the light into your finances.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to reach out to your financial services regulator. If we don't have the answer, we will help you find an answer. And if you're ever in the state of Maine, please look me up.
Well, thank you all so much for those final
Thank you.
thoughts. And again, thank you so very much for taking the time to educate all of us today. This is, as Martin said, these are complex issues, but we really appreciate what we've gotten to learn from all three of you today in terms of how we can navigate this, both for ourselves, for older adults that we're working with, and for the people in our lives that we care about. So thank you all so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for all who attended today, thank you so much for coming. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.